All right, good Friday, everyone. Welcome to another webinar here at D2 Governance Support Services. Today we are going to be dealing with when is it time to remove a board member. Sounds like a fun topic for sure, and one of those ones that I'm sure scares a few people. And so let's bring up Daryl here and say hi to him. Hey, Daryl, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Welcome everybody. Great to see you all here on this particular webinar. Very important one.
Absolutely. A little bit of housekeeping before we get into things today. First up, if you haven't yet, check out d2sup.com. We'll bring that up here so you can take a quick look. Never mind. So, if you go there, you can find all of the courses that Daryl teaches that helps everyone figure out how to support their boards and all the ins and outs, get all of your manuals, all those sorts of things, and you can find all of the back catalog of webinars that we've shot in all sorts of different categories. So that's d2sup.com, d2sup.com. Nice and easy to figure that out. So let's get back to Daryl here and have him walk us through on the fun of removing a board member. Man, Daryl, that sounds like it's got to be a touchy subject.
It is. It's a very sensitive topic, and it's something that most boards are not really comfortable with. So I want to go through some of the actions and responsibilities that lead up to this, and who's responsible making sure it happens, and what the exact steps are and process in removing the board member when you have to.
So we're going to have a chance here for everyone to ask questions here towards the end for sure. So if you have those, drop them in the comments box. If you're watching this on YouTube, after the fact, drop them in there. We get alerted. We use them to kind of create the next piece of content we're doing. So let's start at the beginning, Daryl. When am I going to have to even think about removing a board member?
Well, usually that happens when a board member has been disruptive on a continuous basis. And there are many reasons that a board member can be disruptive. I talked a little bit about that at our previous webinar on the disruptive board member. And I received a lot of feedback on what happens when that case where the board member just hasn't improved, and that is continuing and continuing and continuing. And most boards don't really react to that situation, primarily because they're very much uncomfortable. They have not done it before, so they don't have the experience. And they certainly don't have a policy document that they can use as a resource to follow in an important structure like that. And it's important that you are well structured in the approach. And the reason for that is you want to make sure that it's done in a highly respectful, highly professional and focused manner when you're dealing with that kind of a process. So when a board member has been disruptive, it usually means that they're either dominating a board discussion on a continuous basis. Every time there's a board meeting, every time there are discussion items, they seem to dominate the discussion. And what happens there is the other board members become frustrated and disengaged in a discussion. And that can lead to inappropriate decisions, particularly when nobody else is giving their point of view on a discussion item. So it's important that everybody speak about a discussion item and not be dominated by one person. Another disruptive behavior by a board member is when they're disrespectful to other board members or a particular board member. And this can happen when they don't allow their point of view to get across, or they shoot down their point of view and are very disrespectful in the response that they give the other board members. And that again will disengage the other board members as well. I've seen disruption happen when board members arrive late to a board meeting and expect that the board meeting go back to the start so that they can be brought up to date. That disrupts the entire board meeting and also frustrates the other board members. And I've seen board members that are disruptive when they leave board meetings on a continuous basis early. Now, leaving the board meeting early has certain consequences in that if there's only one or two people that make up the quorum and they happen to leave or depart early, then the quorum is canceled for the remaining part of the meeting and you can't continue on with the business of that part of the meeting. So it's important that you be there for the entire meeting so not to disrupt the meeting as well. And I've also seen where board members have talked about what was supposed to be confidential discussions and what people are saying on the board outside of the board table in the public, and that can cause some reputational damage. And one of the things that you need to keep at the forefront of any disruptive behavior is, will donors find out? Because donors are sponsoring your organization because of your good reputation and because they believe in the good work that you do in the community. But if the reputation is tarnished on the board or organization, they may not want to be part of the process anymore and may withdraw all or part of their financial contribution, and that could be detrimental to the organization. So always keep the board decisions and activities, the donor's perception at the forefront. That way you can be rest assured that you're making the right decisions and actions going forward. So if those kinds of situations happen on a continuous basis, then it's time for the board to act on with that board member. And there's a series of particular areas that you need to go through. There's a structured approach. It's not done in one meeting. It could be up to 4 meetings or even longer. And it also takes, and that will take actually about 4 months. And sometimes it takes 6 months, unless it's extremely serious where it can be immediate. But it's essential that the board deal with that as quickly as possible. And the first thing they would do is review the board bylaws and the governing policy if they have one. If you don't have a governing policy on a disciplinary process, you should have one that will guide you right through each activity, and that way you know that you will not miss anything and you will perform those activities in a very respectful manner. So that's basically what happens leading up to when it is time to remove a board. And Jeremy, in particular, if those disruptive events and behaviors do not improve.
Yeah, you said it can take up to 4 months or 6 months to do this?
The reason for that is you have to give the board member the opportunity to correct that behavior. And usually the behavior happens only at a board meeting. And typically board meetings are every month. So if this particular month it happens and you've addressed it with the board member, you see what happens the next month. And maybe the next month everything's cool and performing well, but the following month he's back or she's back to their old behaviors. And that's why I said it can be a minimum 4 and longer.
So is this something you've ever had to deal with?
Yes. Unfortunately,
it can't be easy.
It isn't. It isn't easy, and I've been on boards where this has happened, and it is, and it hadn't been addressed properly and effectively, and it was allowed to fester over time. And I'll give you a very real life example of what happened when I was on a particular board later in my presentation.
So the other thing you mentioned is it can take that long, but you also quickly mentioned if it's something really serious, I can take care of it quickly. Like, what kind of situation are we talking about where it's serious enough to just warrant kind of cutting it off quick?
I've seen this happen before where it is extremely serious and situations had to be rectified immediately. And some of these examples include one that I lived through, which was not very pleasant, there was an harassment. The board member harassed a member of the staff. And obviously that was beyond our harassment policy and our code of conduct policy. And the board needed to deal with that situation right away. And in that particular instant, they contacted legal advice. Even though they had a policy on a disciplinary process, because this was potentially could have been a legal issue, they dealt with that through their legal channels. And that would be highly recommended. Another example that I've heard of is when a board member has been in serious conflict of interest on a particular decision that's caused some irreparable reputation damage to the board. And again, that could and should result in immediate termination and removal from the board. And again, you would use legal advices around that particular instance. Those are just a couple of severe instances that you would need to deal with that immediately.
So I'm assuming you need to be like really detailed in making sure you record everything that's happening. And Because you mentioned legal. I mean, that usually means lots of documentation, right?
Well, when something like that happens, if there's a conflict of interest or there's an harassment, then you go through the process and you probably would get an independent review done of that particular situation where you're going to be interviewing all parties that were involved or were aware of the situation, and you would bring all of that information to your legal counsel so that you can formulate, the termination process.
So I think it all comes down to, it all falls on the shoulders of our executive director, doesn't it?
Well, in part,
Okay.
the person that's responsible for overseeing the board process is the board chair, and the board chair would make sure that they deal with anytime there's a disruption, and they need to do that immediately. And the reason they need to do that immediately is because they need to send a message to everybody on the board and all key stakeholders that the board has a zero tolerance on that type of behavior. So what the board chair would generally do is meet with the board member to discuss that situation and what the expectations are. And they would bring in, particularly in the first meeting, the vice chair. It's always important to have two people there, and the vice chair would take notes of the entire discussion, so they want to ensure it's accurate. And after the meeting has concluded, the board chair and the vice chair would review the notes, sign the document, and put a copy of the document in the board's file. And there's the best practice that you should have in place. Every board member should have a personal file, not unlike staff. The personal file of the board member would house such information as the original application when the board member came onto the board or applied to become on the board with their resume. There would also be documents that they would have signed off, like the expectations document, like the compliance document around conflict of interest, like code of conduct documents. These kinds of things that the board member were required to sign as part of being on the board would be included as a minimum into the file, and any other information like such as training records or attestations of different things that they've done throughout the year. That way you have something to fall back on. And this process will be reviewing those policies as you go forward with the board member. So the board of director needs to be addressing these as quickly as possible. Now, unfortunately, board members who are ultimately responsible, frankly, for their own code of conduct, if they breach it, they need to be aware that there are consequences, number one. And the board chair needs to address it immediately. And once that's done, it will either result in one or two things. Either the board member is going to correct their behaviors going forward, or they're going to resign and on their own accord to save face. And if that's the case, that's fine. You would rather that they correct their behaviors and move forward as a board member.
So you actually mentioned that there's multiple times that you're talking with this board member. How long should you go?
Well, that's the process, and that should be documented in the disciplinary policy. When the board member is being disruptive, specifically, there's going to be several meetings to give the board member the opportunity to correct their behavior. The first meeting, you would generally just have the vice chair with you as a board chair, and you would first go over the disruptive behavior and to explain to the board member why it is disruptive, what impact it is causing to the rest of the board members, and that they are withdrawing from meetings, they're withdrawing from discussion items, and it could result in inappropriate decisions. And that's not an effective board meeting, an effective structure that you want to have in place. So that should be discussed. And also it should be discussed what the expectations are, in particular around board meetings and conduct around board meetings. And that reference should be made to the particular policy that addresses that. And that document, those notes, should be, as I said, taken by the vice chair, signed off by the board chair and the vice chair, and held in the board member's file. It's not necessary to give the board member the particular notes. That's more for internal use, but it is important that those discussion items are held with the board member. And then they also know the conclusion of that first meeting is if this continues, there are particular consequences that may have happened, and that they have to be aware of, and you would refer to the disciplinary policy. If you don't have those policies in place, it's imperative that you do so, or it's going to be more difficult for you to initiate the corrective action that is required. The next meeting, if there's no improvement, it could be a month down the road at the following board meeting after, or it could be 2 or 3 board meetings in advance. You need to deal with it again as expediently as possible. So following the board meeting, you would contact the board member and you would bring them in for the second discussion. And it may be a different particular disruptive item, but it's all around the disruptive behavior process. So it's a continuation. So what you would do is outline what you discussed the last time, the disruptive behavior, and what has happened this time again, and reiterate the policies that you were referring to for conduct around board meetings and around being respectful or what have you. And in that particular case, that second meeting, you will provide the board member with a written letter and a warning, and saying this needs to be improved upon going forward, or it can result in removal from the board. You need to be that specific. That letter would be signed off by the board chair and by the vice chair and provided to the board member. Now, in my experience, that when a board member actually sees a tangible document, they will either correct or they will resign immediately from the board. And you would prefer that they correct their action and stay with the board and move forward. But if they're going to resign, it's probably the best course of action as opposed to moving to having to remove them from the organization. The third meeting would happen, again, a month or 2 or 3 down the road if the corrective action is still not evident. And in that particular case, you refer to the previous 2 meetings, the previous letter, and you would simply give them a termination letter that they are no longer to be on the board. They are being removed effective immediately because of conduct that is outside the policy documents and the discussion items that you've had on a regular basis with them over a period of time. It is causing dissension amongst the board members, frustration, and you can even have board members that by the time you even get to the end are resigning from the organization because they are just upset enough that they don't want to be a part of the organization. So it's important that you address it as quickly as possible to avoid that situation. And once the board member gets his letter or her letter, then the request is that they return immediately and with a set time frame any proprietary information. While that could be books, binders, access codes, whatever the information is. It could even be laptops. They need to return that as soon as possible, and you need to remove the capability of them accessing any information on the board, whether it's electronic or even access to the premises, if some of them have keys. So those are the things that you need to deal with right away. And once that is done, and the board member is no longer a part of the organization, the final course is that you need to prepare a communication. The communication needs to go to the key stakeholders, such as the rest of the board, the staff, and even key donors. The reason you do that is so that everybody is aware that this individual is no longer with the board. You do not give reasons why they're not with the board. You need to be short and sweet that they're just not part of the board anymore, and that you wish them all the best in their future endeavors. That way, anybody that's talking to that board member that is a key stakeholder knows that they're not a part of the organization anymore. And if that board member says anything outside, well, that's something you can't control right away, unless it's very detrimental to the organization, and then you would contact your legal counsel. But you need to be private and confidential and respectful of the situation with that particular board member, and just keep the communication very focused and very simple.
So it sounds like what we're talking about here has to be very well thought out, very well planned. You need to have your process in place, know exactly how you're going to handle board members like this. But I I know some of us don't like to deal with these people, and some guys can just run off and keep disrupting the board over and over again, that kind of thing. What happens if I don't take care of this? What happens if I don't step in and deal with it?
Well, I sort of alluded to it a little bit. If you don't, it's going to cause some reputational damage. And that, to me, is one of the things that really concerns me with boards, is that you need to understand how this can impact the reputation of your organization if you don't deal with any kind of a situation, let alone to disrupt a board member. Because when it gets out into the public, it can cause some irreparable damage to the organization, and particularly with donors, and even trying to attract even new board members if they believe that the organization is such that this kind of behavior is allowed to continue. So those are the kinds of things you need to really be aware of. Most boards do not address it properly, and that's unfortunate, but it's not totally unexpected, because many of the board members have not had the experience in dealing with disruptive people in their work lives, and how to remove them from an organization, or even leading up to addressing the situation so that they can at least correct it. That is some experience that most do not have. And so it's important that you have a guiding resource so that you can deal with it. And it's, as I said, it's up to the board chair to deal with it. And one of the easiest ways, before you even get to having a separate meeting with the board member, is to address some of those things right at the board table. For example, if the board member is being controlling of a discussion item and dominated it, you need to close down that discussion immediately. I talked about this in my previous webinar, but that's what you have to do. And if it takes you doing that over and over and over again, you need to do it, and have that discussion with the board member off site, and to say to them that you can no longer be doing that, or there's going to be consequences. But you deal with it right at the board table. And if they're being disrespectful at the board table, you also deal with that. You say, generally to the person, that is disrespectful. I said you need to apologize, and you can do that right there at the board table to the board member, and that kind of discussion and that kind of behavior will not be tolerated. You need to be very forceful when those kinds of things happen. And in the case where they're coming late and they want to go back and review, you say absolutely not. You knew what time it was, and we understand it could have been some kind of a circumstance that was unforeseen that you're late, but usually it's been on a continuous basis, and we're going to just continue the board meeting. They will get the message. And if they don't, then you will address that in the meetings that I have spoken about. Now, there is an example I would like to talk about, and I alluded to that at the very first of the meeting, where I was on a particular board, and the board chair did not deal with it. And unfortunately, and so what was happening in this particular case, the disruption was that this board member was always controlling the board discussion, every agenda item, and was cutting people off and not allowing them to really get their point of view across. And unfortunately, decisions were being made that were maybe questionable. But what was happening is the rest of the board members were getting more and more and more frustrated, and more disengaged in the discussion. And at the end of the day, a couple of them resigned. And we find out at the next board meeting that 2 people had tendered their resignation. We didn't know why. It wasn't said why they tendered their resignation, but we suspected one of the reasons, because they were more vocal after meetings of why bother being at the meetings when it's being controlled by one board member. Unfortunately, those individuals they had a grudge, and they were still upset, and they were at a public event and spoke about the situation. And also at that public event was one of our donors. So subsequently, a few days later, our board chair receives a phone call from the donor, concerned about what he had heard at this public event, and wanted a little bit of an explanation. And unfortunately, we didn't have a very good explanation. We met with the executive, the board chair and the executive, and the donor to discuss the situation. And the donor had an expectation. The donor had an expectation that the board would conduct its affairs in a very diligent and appropriate manner. And the fact that this situation arose caused them concern with their sponsorship. In fact, they were going to consider whether they were going to continue in part or at all in their sponsorship going forward. In this particular case, they put us basically on probation. We will continue with our sponsorship, they said, but if something like this happens again, we are withdrawing all of it. So the board needed to address that. And there were several board members, a good many of them, decided to have a discussion with the board chair and called a meeting with the board chair and the executive and whoever wanted to attend to discuss the situation and what we needed to do. And it was a very heated discussion at the outside because the board chair felt that he was being penalized for not dealing with the situation, where in fact he wasn't dealing with the situation, and the board needed to address it properly. So they decided over several meetings to create the policies and documents that they needed to avoid this situation, and made sure that the board chair had training around conducting effective board meetings so they knew how to deal with these situations going forward. So that took several months. We hired an independent facilitator to help with that process, and over time it improved dramatically. But it could have resulted in a loss of significant sponsorship from one of our major donors.
I think that's a huge takeaway right there. That's something that you don't really think about. You think about the board member is, trying to make their point and constantly bringing this point back up, or whatever it is that's causing them to be disruptive in the meetings. You think, oh, it's just the meetings. It's not like it's going to affect outside the board, right? But your example shows that these guys really can be detrimental to the whole organization if they're not dealt with properly.
Absolutely, and you don't know what people are going to say when they leave, and if they're upset and still upset because a situation wasn't dealt with properly. They originally went on the board because they believed in the cause and they enjoyed what they were doing, except for the board meetings. And when this was happening, it causes dissension, and the frustration gets to a boiling point where they see no alternative but to leave. And they're in a public event and things happen, and you got to be prepared for that. And it's very, very important that you have the right policies, processes in place, and these things are dealt with expediently. Ideally, you want to see corrective behaviors, and sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. But occasionally, these kinds of things are going to happen where the only course of action is removal.
And you can lose good people if you don't deal with it quickly too.
Correct.
Yeah, okay. So to sum it all up, the basic idea here is have a plan in place, catch it early. It's almost like a 3-strike rule almost. You have those meetings that are very private between the disruptive member, the board chair, and maybe you said, I think the vice president was the other one you said.
Yes.
And then if it's not dealt with, handle it. Remove them, that kind of thing. Take your time. It can take a while to do it, right? That's the other key takeaway I heard today.
Absolutely. Those are all the key pieces. And having that plan documented in a policy is very, very important. And following the process that's structured, respectful, and professional is very important. And you don't rush it. You need to go do your due diligence and give the board member the opportunity to improve. And if they're not going to, well, then you need to deal with it.
So Daryl, as I pull the questions up, can you tell me where we can find all of this documentation, and how can I get help with this stuff if I'm maybe I'm one of those directors or one of those folks, the chairs, who I don't know how to deal with them? Where can I go for some help?
You can get help on our website, d2sup.com, and we have packages around board meeting conduct. We have packages on board member expectations. We have documentation on key governing policies that you would need, such as the disciplinary policy, such as the board meeting policy. Those kinds of pieces of information are on our website that you can purchase and follow the process. And as long as you have those resources, you will be in a much, much better position. And if you don't have those resources and you need to deal with somebody now, highly recommend that you approach your solicitor, because the legal advice that they will provide will be similar and help you through the process.
Perfect segue, because we're going to jump to some questions. You ready?
I am ready.
All right, we've got one from Carolyn here. She says, you mentioned legal assistance in removing a board member. That makes sense. I'm curious, though, she says, if a board member contests their removal, what potential action could they take?
Well, that's interesting point, is that to contest it, they would need to be able to demonstrate that they were not being disruptive. And if they can do that, then maybe it takes longer. But the longer the process, the only way that they can contest, if you're giving them the opportunity to correct their behavior, is when they haven't corrected their behavior. And if you have well-documented situations. So when you're going into the discussion, you have that situation, right? And you're saying to the board member, you're very, very explicit. You're saying, on this board meeting date, on this discussion item, this is what happened. And you go through the process, exactly what happened. And then you ask them, do you have any rebuttal, any thoughts around the process and around what was said and how your behavior was. If they don't, and 9 out of 10 chances they don't. But if they do and they feel that, well, that's not the way I normally operate, well, okay then. I brought this to your attention because it has caused an impact to the board and to the other board members. So we're just having this verbal discussion today. You know what needs to be corrected, and you're saying that it was unintentional, then let's see how we progress. If it happens again, or something similar, then again, when you're having that meeting, you're very explicit. The date of the meeting, exactly the issue that was being discussed, what happened, so that everybody knows exactly what the situation was. Very difficult to argue those kinds of things when it's been that descriptive. It's not unlike when you're having a behavioral discussion with an employee. You need to be very, very descriptive, and who he said, she said, and what it looked like, and get that information from the board member, what they thought that they were saying and how they were coming across. And 9 times out of 10, as I said, they're going to realize that the situation was not appropriate. They needed to correct their behavior. And there will not be a recourse. When you go through this over a period of time, several meetings, and in the 3 strikes, as you said, that gives the board member lots of opportunity to be fully compliant or to remove themselves from the situation before being removed.
Thorough as always, Daryl. Carolyn, if you want to let us know whether or not that answered your question or not, like everyone else, just let us know. There's a little bit of a delay, so we're going to jump onto another question while this comes through for you. So let's take a look here. Sticking with the legal stuff, is it necessary to seek legal advice when considering the removal of a board member?
Well, I mentioned up front that if you have a very solid governing policy that outlines the specific process in the disciplinary matter, then and that has had legal review, if you will, then you're okay to follow the process on a board member. And most board members are volunteers, and the chances are contesting removal are very slim, but possible. But if you're uncomfortable in any part of the process, even with a governing policy, I highly recommend that you seek the resources of legal counsel. And legal counsel will even come to the meeting with you and help you with the process. I've even seen legal counsel be at meetings where the board chair didn't even have to say anything. The legal counsel went through the process, and just a little bit of discussion from the board chair. So, you can use that as a resource if you need to. But that would only get down to when you're in your 2nd and 3rd meeting. Certainly the first meeting, where you're just talking about the situation that's happened and you're very, very clear and concise, that I wouldn't suggest you would need. legal counsel, but the second, possibly the third, definitely, if you feel uncomfortable.
Sounds good. All right. So, for our last question for today, it says, I'm on a board, but it doesn't feel like anything's being done to take action. What can I do as a board member if I feel like nothing's being done to help remove this problem we're having?
That's a good question. Now, you got to be careful because some things could be done, but you've got to remember that those discussions that are happening, and if they are happening, in this particular case, they are private and confidential. So you're not going to know about them because they're just with the vice chair, the board chair, and the board member. And that's the way it should be because you need to protect the privacy of the board member in these kinds of situations. But if you feel that nothing's being done because you don't know about that, then it's up to you to bring it to the board chair's attention. And you would do that not at a board meeting, but off-site, phone call or a meeting, and say that you're concerned about this. And these are the things that are affecting you being on the board and your participation level. And you say others as well, but you can't speak for others. You can only speak for yourself. So you can bring that to the attention of the board chair. And if they are not dealing with it, hopefully that will send a message to them to deal with it. If there's not a policy or procedure that you have in place, you may want to ask the board as well, do we have a disciplinary policy to deal with this? Or do we have a board meeting policy to deal with this? Those are things that are important that you would bring forward.
I want to thank everyone again today for their questions. Daryl, thanks again for taking us through what is probably really a touchy subject for a lot of people to deal with, is removing that board member. So, once again, if everyone is looking to find out where they can get more information, I'm going to point you to a few places. First off, this Facebook page, where if you're watching it live, that's where you're seeing it. Absolutely, look here for anything that's coming down the pipe. Our webinars are starting up, and we're doing more of them more often, starting in January. Check out d2sup.com, d2sup.com, where you can find every one of these webinars, as well as tons of training that Daryl's done from his years and years of experience, as he is our expert on site here. And lastly, if you're watching this on YouTube, check stuff down in the comments. Ask us some questions there. It helps us add more things here. So again, thank you everyone for your questions today. Daryl, thank you again for your expertise as always.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And I just want to make one point that you said. Highly sensitive subject, I understand, and it's a very difficult one, but it's one that is necessary. So if you have any concerns of the process, then you need to get as much information as possible before you start.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Daryl. Thanks again, everyone. We will see you back on another one. Bye now.
Bye-bye.